Captain Viktor Petrov pulled the stick hard left as tracer rounds tore past his canopy just meters away. The German Messerschmitt was right on his tail, and every instinct screamed at him to climb, to gain altitude like he had been taught in every air combat manual he had ever read. But Viktor did something that would have gotten him court-martialed in any American squadron. He pushed the nose down, diving toward the birch trees below until the snow-covered branches seemed close enough to touch. The Airacobra responded instantly, rolling with a precision that felt almost supernatural. Then he squeezed the trigger, and the 37mm cannon mounted directly beneath his seat roared to life, sending a shell straight up into the belly of a Heinkel bomber that had been cruising confidently overhead. The explosion lit up the winter sky like a second sun. German pilots would later report encountering what they called a snake with teeth, a predator that hunted from the shadows below the clouds. But Viktor knew the truth. This was no snake. This was an Airacobra, and he had just discovered how to make it deadly. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of how Soviet pilots transformed the most hated fighter plane in the American arsenal into one of the deadliest weapons on the Eastern Front began not with triumph, but with disappointment and frustration that ran deeper than the frozen Russian soil. When the first shipments of Bell P-39 Airacobras arrived at the Soviet airfields in the winter of 1942 under the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet pilots gathered around the strange-looking aircraft with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright suspicion. The plane looked wrong from every angle. Unlike conventional fighters where the engine sat in the nose, the Airacobra's Allison engine was mounted behind the pilot, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. The nose, instead of housing a radial engine, contained a massive 37mm cannon that fired through the propeller hub. American pilots had nicknamed it the Flying Coffin, a name that had reached Soviet ears along with stories of poor high-altitude performance, engine failures, and a tendency to tumble into deadly flat spins. Major Dmitry Volkov stood in the snow beside one of the newly arrived aircraft, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter February air. He was 32 years old, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and the opening months of the Great Patriotic War. He had flown Polikarpov F-16 16 biplanes against the Luftwaffe and survived encounters that had killed better pilots than himself. Now he was being asked to transition to this American machine that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts left over from 3 different aircraft designs. The technical officer, a young lieutenant named Nikolai Sokolov, who had studied engineering at Moscow State University before the war, stood beside him with a clipboard full of specifications and performance data. The numbers Nikolai read aloud did nothing to improve Dmitry's mood. Maximum speed of 360 miles per hour at 13,800 feet. Service ceiling of 35,000 feet, though American reports noted severe performance degradation above 15,000 feet. Rate of climb that was mediocre compared to the Yashi-9 or even the aging MiG-3. Range of 525 miles with external tanks. Armament that included the 37mm cannon with 30 rounds, 250 caliber machine guns in the nose with 200 rounds each, and 430 caliber machine guns in the wings with 1,000 rounds total. The weight was concerning, over 7,000 pounds fully loaded, heavy for a single engine fighter, but it was the high altitude performance that worried Dmitry most. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies over much of the Eastern Front, and German pilots preferred to fight with altitude advantage, diving down on Soviet aircraft from above, where their superior climb rate and ceiling gave them every tactical advantage. Captain Viktor Petrov was 25 years old when he first climbed into the cockpit of an Airacobra. He had grown up in Stalingrad, the son of a factory foreman who had taught him that every machine had a purpose, and that purpose was not always the one its designer intended. Viktor had learned to fly in gliders as a teenager, part of the Osoaviakim program that had prepared thousands of Soviet youth for military aviation. When the war came, he had transitioned to fighters and quickly discovered he had a natural talent for air combat, an instinctive understanding of three-dimensional geometry that let him predict where an enemy aircraft would be rather than where it was. He had shot down 5 German aircraft in his first 3 months of combat, flying an E-16, earning him a place in one of the elite fighter regiments being reformed with new equipment. The first training flights in the Airacobra confirmed every worry the Soviet pilots had. At 12,000 feet, where the Messerschmitt Bf-109 could dance and climb like a homesick angel, the Airacobra felt heavy and sluggish. The controls responded, but with a delay that could get you killed in a turning fight against an experienced German pilot. Viktor tried a mock dogfight against another Airacobra flown by his wingman, Lieutenant Pavel Kozlov, a farm boy from Ukraine who had a gift for aerobatics. They climbed to 15,000 feet and began a series of practice maneuvers. The results were discouraging. Turn rate was adequate, but not exceptional. Climb performance at that altitude was poor enough that a diving Messerschmitt could easily gain separation after an attack run. The engine developed carburetor icing problems that caused rough running. Several pilots reported the driveshaft creating uncomfortable vibrations that made precise aiming difficult. After 2 weeks of training flights, Major Volkov called a meeting of all the squadron pilots in the operations tent. 23 men crowded into the space heated by a single wood stove, their faces showing the strain of trying to master an aircraft that seemed determined to get them killed. Volkov stood at the front beside a chalkboard where someone had drawn a crude diagram of the Airacobra's side profile. The mood was grim. 3 pilots had already put in requests for transfer back to Yak fighters. 2 had filed official complaints about the aircraft's handling characteristics. 1 had survived a flat spin at 8,000 feet only because he had enough altitude to recover, an experience that had left him shaking so badly he could not fly for 2 days. Volkov let the complaints flow for 10 minutes, listening as his pilots detailed every flaw and weakness they had discovered. Then he held up his hand for silence. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who had survived when better pilots had died. He told them that complaining about the aircraft they had been given was a waste of breath that could be better used for flying. The Americans had sent them the Airacobra because it was what they could spare, not because it was what the Soviets wanted. But every aircraft, Volkov continued, had strengths as well as weaknesses. Their job as pilots was not to wish for a different plane, but to find the strengths of the one they had and exploit those strengths until their enemies bled. Viktor raised his hand and stood when Volkov nodded at him. He had been thinking about the problem for days, lying awake in his bunk while the winter wind howled outside and the distant rumble of artillery reminded everyone that the war was never far away. The Airacobra, Viktor said, was designed by Americans who fought a different kind of war at different altitudes against different enemies. American doctrine emphasized high-altitude bomber interception. American pilots wanted to climb above the enemy and dive down with speed advantage. But on the Eastern Front, the war was different. Soviet pilots were not intercepting bomber formations at 20,000 feet. They were supporting ground troops, attacking enemy positions, and fighting at the altitudes where the real war was happening, down low, where you could see the faces of the men you were trying to kill or save. Viktor walked to the chalkboard and drew a simple diagram, a horizontal line representing the ground, another line at 3,000 feet, and a third at 10,000 feet. He marked the area between ground level and 3,000 feet with heavy chalk strokes. This, he said, was where the Airacobra might have advantages that had nothing to do with the performance specifications in the manual. The heavy weight that made it sluggish at altitude would make it stable at low level, able to fly straight through turbulence and ground effect that would bounce a lighter aircraft around. The nose-mounted cannon that seemed awkward and hard to aim would have a different trajectory at low altitude, firing almost flat instead of the arcing path needed at high altitude. The tight roll rate that several pilots had mentioned, that might be the key to everything. Pavel Kozlov spoke up from the back of the tent, his Ukrainian accent thick with skepticism. He pointed out that flying at low altitude meant exposing yourself to ground fire from every German soldier with a rifle. It meant less room to recover from mistakes, less altitude to trade for speed or position. It meant flying in the kill zone, where one hit from enemy flak could tear your wing off before you even knew you were being shot at. The risks, Pavel argued, outweighed any theoretical advantages Viktor was proposing. Several other pilots nodded in agreement. Low-altitude combat was something you did when you had no choice, not something you sought out deliberately. But Major Volkov was staring at the chalkboard with an expression that Viktor recognized from briefings before dangerous missions. It was the look of a man calculating odds and seeing a possibility that others had missed. Volkov told them they would spend the next week conducting low-altitude training exercises, not the standard low-altitude work, which meant anything below 10,000 feet, but truly low altitude, down in the weeds where you could count the trees and read the expressions on the faces of surprised farmers. They would practice flying at speeds and altitudes that would terrify anyone with functioning survival instincts. They would learn the Airacobra's characteristics at 50 feet, at 20 feet, at altitudes where a momentary lapse in concentration meant auguring into the frozen earth at 300 miles per hour. The training began the next morning, with Victor leading a flight of 4 aircraft down to treetop level over the empty steppes east of the airfield. At 100 feet, the Airacobra felt different, more responsive, as if the aircraft had been waiting for someone to fly it this way. At 50 feet, with the ground blurring past below and the propeller wash kicking up snow devils in their wake, Victor began to understand what the aircraft could do. He rolled left, then right, testing how quickly the Airacobra responded at high speed and low altitude. The response was immediate, crisp, with none of the mushy delay he had felt at 12,000 feet. He pulled up into a climb, converting speed to altitude, then pushed over and dove back down, leveling out at 30 feet. The acceleration was impressive. The stability was remarkable. The airplane wanted to fly straight and level at low altitude, which meant he could focus on aiming rather than constantly fighting to maintain altitude and attitude. On the 3rd day of low-altitude training, they encountered their first German aircraft. It was a Henschel HS-126 reconnaissance plane, flying at 4,000 feet on a photography mission over Soviet positions. Standard doctrine would have been to climb, gain altitude advantage, and attack from above. But Victor was leading the flight, and he made a decision that his wingmen would later swear was either genius or insanity. He kept the flight at 500 feet and increased speed, positioning his 4 aircraft directly below and slightly ahead of the Henschel's flight path. The German crew never saw them coming. Soviet fighters were supposed to be thousands of feet above, climbing desperately to reach interception altitude. They were not supposed to be hiding in the ground clutter, invisible to the Henschel's observer, who was scanning the sky above and behind for threats. Victor waited until the Henschel was directly overhead, then pulled up sharply and squeezed the trigger. The 37mm cannon fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. At this range and angle, the shells traveled almost vertically upward into the Henschel's belly. The first round punched through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin and exploded inside the fuselage. The second round severed the tail controls. The third round was unnecessary because the Henschel was already coming apart, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away as the aircraft tumbled out of the sky, trailing smoke and flame. Victor's wingmen, flying in tight formation behind him, did not fire a shot. They did not need to. The Henschel crew never had a chance to react, never had a chance to evade or return fire. One moment, they were flying a routine reconnaissance mission. The next moment, they were falling out of the sky in a burning aircraft, killed by an enemy they never saw from an angle they never expected. The kill was witnessed by Soviet ground troops who had been under German observation for days. By the time Victor landed back at the airfield, the story had already spread. The pilot who had shot down a German reconnaissance plane by attacking straight up from below, like a shark rising from deep water. The tactic was unorthodox, dangerous, and completely contrary to every principle of air combat that had been taught since the First World War. It was also devastatingly effective. Major Volkov ordered 3 bottles of vodka to be distributed among the flight crews that evening, and he personally raised a glass to Victor, while the other pilots gathered around to hear the story, recounted with increasing embellishment. Over the next 2 weeks, the squadron refined the low-altitude tactics that would become their signature. They learned to use terrain masking, hiding behind hills and tree lines until they were in position to attack. They learned to coordinate attacks so that while one flight engaged from below, another flight would be positioned to intercept any enemy aircraft that tried to climb away. They learned that the Airacobra's roll rate, which was merely adequate at high altitude, was exceptional at low altitude where air density gave the ailerons more authority. They could roll into and out of attack positions faster than any German pilot expected, making deflection shots nearly impossible and giving them the initiative in any low-altitude engagement. Lieutenant Kozlov, who had been skeptical of the tactics, became one of their most effective practitioners. His background growing up on a farm in Ukraine had given him an instinctive understanding of terrain that translated perfectly to low-altitude combat. He could read the landscape like a map, knowing where valleys would provide concealment, where hills would create blind spots for enemy observers, where rivers and roads would channel aircraft into predictable flight paths. On February 23, 1943, Kozlov led his flight of 3 Airacobras to intercept a formation of Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bombers that were attacking Soviet artillery positions. The Stukas were escorted by 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters flying top cover at 8,000 feet. Standard doctrine would have been suicidal. 3 fighters attacking 7 aircraft, including experienced Messerschmitt pilots. The mathematics did not favor Soviet survival. But Kozlov was not following standard doctrine. He led his flight at 50 feet, using a river valley to approach the target area without being detected. The Messerschmitts were watching for threats from above and behind, scanning the sky for the characteristic silhouettes of Soviet fighters climbing to intercept. They were not watching the ground. Kozlov waited until the Stukas had committed to their dive bomb runs, their attention focused on the targets below, their escort fighters maintaining position overhead. Then he pulled up sharply and opened fire. The 37mm cannon was designed to destroy light tanks and fortifications from the air. Against the thin-skinned Stuka dive bombers pulling out of their attack runs at low altitude, the effect was catastrophic. Kozlov's first burst hit a Stuka in the engine, and the heavy shell tore through the Junkers bomber like paper, severing fuel lines and hydraulics. The Stuka nosed over and crashed into the ground in a ball of flame. His wingman, a young pilot named Alexei Volkov, who was the major's nephew, fired at a second Stuka and missed, but his tracers passed so close to the German pilot's canopy that the Stuka pilot panicked and pulled up directly into the 3rd Airacobra's line of fire. That Stuka disintegrated in midair, its wings torn off by the concentrated fire from 4 .30 caliber machine guns and 2 .50 caliber guns all firing simultaneously. The Messerschmitts above finally realized what was happening and dove to engage, but they were diving into a situation that violated every assumption about air combat they had been taught. Soviet fighters were supposed to be above them, or at least at their altitude, not down in the weeds where maneuvering room was measured in meters, and one mistake meant flying into the ground. Kozlov and his wingmen did not try to dogfight the Messerschmitts. Instead, they scattered in 3 different directions, flying at maximum speed barely above the treetops, forcing the German pilots to either follow them into the dangerous low-altitude environment or break off the pursuit. 2 of the Messerschmitt pilots chose to follow, and both died within 30 seconds. One pulled too hard in a turn, trying to get a shot at Alexei, and his Messerschmitt's wing clipped a stand of birch trees, cartwheeling the aircraft into the frozen ground. The second Messerschmitt got on Kozlov's tail, but could not match the Airacobra's roll rate at low altitude. Kozlov snapped into a hard rolling turn that the Messerschmitt pilot tried to follow, but the German fighter's controls were less responsive at that altitude and speed, and the pilot overcorrected, going inverted at 150 feet with insufficient altitude to recover. The remaining Messerschmitts and Stukas fled the area, and Kozlov led his flight back to base, having shot down 2 Stukas and been credited with 2 Messerschmitt kills without losing a single aircraft or even taking significant damage. The ground troops they had been protecting sent a case of captured German cognac to the squadron along with a thank you note signed by every man in the artillery battery. Major Volkov promoted Kozlov to captain on the spot and assigned him to train other pilots in the low-altitude tactics that were proving so effective. By March of 1943, the reputation of the Airacobra equipped Soviet squadrons was spreading through both Soviet and German intelligence networks. German pilots began filing reports about Soviet fighters that attacked from below, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. They described the Airacobra's distinctive engine sound, different from any other fighter because of the mid-mounted engine configuration. They described tactics that seemed suicidal, aircraft flying at altitudes where they should have been easy targets for ground fire, yet somehow surviving and inflicting heavy casualties. The Germans started calling the Airacobra-equipped units the Snakes or the Vipers, fighters that hid in the grass and struck without warning from below. Luftwaffe commanders, who had grown accustomed to dominating Soviet fighters through superior altitude performance, found themselves forced to adapt their tactics. They issued orders requiring fighter escorts to maintain lower patrol altitudes, which burned more fuel and reduced their operational radius. They warned bomber crews to watch below as well as above, creating additional stress and distraction for crews already dealing with heavy flak and the constant threat of interception. They began avoiding certain areas where Airacobra units were known to operate, routes and targets that were now considered too dangerous because Soviet fighters had learned to turn an American cast-off into an effective weapon. Viktor Petrov's reputation grew with every mission. By the spring of 1943, he had 15 confirmed kills, all achieved in the Airacobra, using the low-altitude tactics he had helped develop. He had been promoted to captain and given command of his own flight. His aircraft, an Airacobra with the number 14 painted on the nose in red, had become recognizable to both Soviet ground troops and German pilots. The Germans put a price on his head, spreading word through their intelligence networks that any pilot who could confirm shooting down the red-nosed Airacobra would receive an Iron Cross First Class and 2 weeks' leave in Berlin. Viktor learned about the bounty from Soviet intelligence officers and laughed it off. Though privately, he began varying his flight paths and attack patterns to avoid becoming predictable. The weapons loadout of the Airacobra proved ideal for the ground attack missions that were becoming increasingly important as the war turned against Germany. The 37mm cannon could destroy light vehicles, artillery positions, and fortified machine gun nests with single shots. The machine guns could strafe infantry and suppress anti-aircraft positions. The aircraft's stability at low altitude made it an excellent platform for precision attacks on point targets. Soviet ground commanders began requesting Airacobra support specifically, knowing that a flight of Airacobras flying low and fast could break up German counterattacks or eliminate strong points that were holding up Soviet advances. In late April 1943, Viktor's squadron was assigned to support a major Soviet offensive aimed at retaking a strategic railway junction that had been in German hands since the previous summer. The junction was heavily defended with multiple flak batteries, dug-in infantry with machine guns and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and at least one company of German tanks positioned to counterattack any Soviet breakthrough. Soviet intelligence reported that the Germans had reinforced the position with a squadron of Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters based at a nearby airfield, ready to respond to any Soviet air activity in the sector. The battle plan called for a massive artillery barrage followed by an infantry assault supported by tanks. Viktor's squadron would provide air cover and ground attack support, suppressing German anti-aircraft positions and attacking any German aircraft that tried to interfere with the assault. It was the kind of mission that would have been considered nearly impossible in the early days of the war when the Luftwaffe dominated Soviet skies. But 3 years of brutal combat had transformed the Soviet Air Force from a force that was barely holding on to one that could challenge German air superiority on equal terms. The attack began at dawn on April 27th with an artillery barrage that turned the German positions into a moonscape of craters and shattered fortifications. Viktor led his flight of 8 Airacobras at low altitude toward the target area, staying below 200 feet to avoid German radar detection. They approached from the east, using the morning sun to blind German observers. The plan was to hit the German flak positions first, clearing the way for follow on waves of ground attack aircraft that would strike the German tanks and infantry positions. As they approached the target area, Viktor could see the German flak batteries firing at the higher altitude Soviet aircraft that were attacking from 10,000 feet. The Germans were focused on the high-altitude threat, exactly as planned. Viktor armed his cannon and machine guns, checking his instruments one last time. Behind him, his 7 wingmen were in loose formation, spread out enough that a single burst of flak could not hit more than one aircraft, but close enough to coordinate their attacks. He pushed the throttle forward and dove toward the nearest flak battery, a quad-mounted 20mm gun that was pumping shells into the sky at a rate that would shred any aircraft that flew through its fire cone. Viktor's attack run lasted approximately 4 seconds from the moment he lined up on the target to the moment he pulled up and away. In those 4 seconds, he fired 6 rounds from the 37mm cannon and approximately 200 rounds from his machine guns. The flak battery disappeared in a series of explosions as the heavy cannon shells struck the gun position and detonated the battery's ammunition. The German gun crew never knew what hit them. They were watching the sky above for Soviet aircraft, not the ground-level approach that put Victor's Airacobra at exactly the right angle to fire, straight into their position without ever entering their field of fire. Behind Victor, his wingmen were attacking the other German flak positions with similar success. The combination of surprise, speed, and the devastating firepower of the 37mm cannon overwhelmed the German defenses. Within 90 seconds of the first attack, 5 of the 6 German flak batteries in the sector had been destroyed or damaged so severely they were out of action. The 6th battery managed to get off a burst that tore holes through the wing of one Airacobra, but the aircraft remained flyable and the pilot managed to make it back to base for an emergency landing. With the flak suppressed, Victor's squadron turned their attention to the German armored vehicles that were moving to counterattack the Soviet infantry assault. The Airacobra's 37mm cannon was not powerful enough to penetrate the frontal armor of a German panzer tank, but it could destroy the lighter armored vehicles that accompanied the tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars, and self-propelled guns. More importantly, it could force the German tanks to button up, closing their hatches and limiting their visibility, making them vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank teams that were infiltrating through the German lines. Victor made 3 more attack runs on German positions before the Focke-Wulf fighters arrived from their nearby airfield. There were 12 of them, and they came in fast and high, diving down on the Soviet aircraft with the altitude advantage that German pilots preferred. But Victor and his pilots were ready. They had been expecting German reinforcements, and they had maintained enough discipline during their ground attacks to keep track of their altitude, their fuel state, and their formation integrity. When the call came over the radio that German fighters were inbound, Victor did not try to climb and meet them. Instead, he dove even lower, leading his squadron down to 50 feet above the ground and increasing speed to maximum. The German pilots, who had been briefed that Soviet fighters would try to climb away when engaged, found themselves diving after aircraft that were flying barely above the treetops at speeds that made precise shooting nearly impossible. At that altitude, the Focke-Wulf's superior high-altitude performance meant nothing. What mattered was low-altitude handling, roll rate, and the nerve to fly that close to the ground at 350 miles per hour. The Airacobra excelled at all 3. Victor led the German fighters on a chase through valleys and around hills, using the terrain to break their radar lock and force them to rely on visual tracking. Every time a German pilot tried to line up a shot, Victor would snap into a hard rolling turn that the heavier Focke-Wulf could not match at that altitude and speed. The fight degenerated into a wild chase across the battlefield, with aircraft from both sides weaving through artillery fire and dodging their own ground forces. 2 German pilots collided with each other, trying to follow the same Airacobra through a tight turn. A 3rd German pilot pulled too hard trying to get a shot and blacked out from the G-forces, his aircraft plowing into the ground when he could not recover in time. The remaining German pilots, realizing they were in a fight they could not win, broke off and headed back to their airfield. Victor's squadron had not shot down a single German aircraft in air-to-air combat, but they had forced the Germans to flee by using tactics that turned the Focke-Wulf's advantages into liabilities. The Soviet offensive succeeded in capturing the railway junction, a victory that would have been impossible without the air support provided by Victor's squadron and other Airacobra-equipped units. The German defenders, who had been confident they could hold against any Soviet ground assault, found themselves unable to coordinate an effective defense when their communications were disrupted by constant air attacks, and their anti-aircraft defenses were systematically destroyed. Soviet commanders cited the Airacobra units in their after-action reports as a decisive factor in the battle's outcome. By the summer of 1943, the transformation of the P-39 Airacobra from American reject to Soviet success story was complete. More than 4,700 Airacobras would eventually be delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, making up approximately 1/3 of all Lend-Lease aircraft received by the Soviets. Soviet pilots would ultimately shoot down more enemy aircraft in the Airacobra than American pilots did, despite the Americans having invented and built the aircraft. Several Soviet pilots would become aces flying exclusively the Airacobra, including Alexander Pokrishkin, who would become the 2nd highest scoring Soviet ace of the war, with 59 kills. The secret to the Soviet success with the Airacobra was not that the aircraft was better than American pilots thought. It was that Soviet pilots discovered a completely different way to use the aircraft, exploiting characteristics that American doctrine ignored or considered liabilities. At high altitude, the Airacobra was underpowered and outclassed by German fighters. At low altitude, where Soviet pilots chose to fight, it became a deadly weapon that combined firepower, stability, and maneuverability in a package that German pilots learned to fear and respect. Viktor Petrov survived the war with 27 confirmed kills, all in the Airacobra. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union medal twice, one of only 65 Soviet pilots to receive the award multiple times. After the war, he stayed in the Soviet Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1968. He kept a photograph on his desk for the rest of his life, a grainy black and white image showing him standing beside his red-nosed Airacobra in the spring of 1943, young and confident and completely unaware that he had helped write a new chapter in the history of air combat. Major Dmitry Volkov also survived the war, retiring as a general and spending his final years teaching at the Soviet Air Force Academy. He would tell his students that the greatest lesson he learned during the war was not about tactics or technology, but about the importance of understanding that every weapon has an optimal use, and that optimal use is not always the one its creators intended. The Americans built the Airacobra to intercept bombers at high altitude, and by that measure, it failed. But the Soviets discovered it could dominate at low altitude, and by that measure, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Lieutenant Pavel Kozlov finished the war as a major with 32 confirmed kills. He returned to his family farm in Ukraine after the war, but found that 4 years of flying fighters had left him unable to settle into the quiet life of a farmer. He moved to Moscow and worked as a test pilot for the Soviet aviation industry, helping to develop the next generation of fighters that would eventually replace the Airacobra. He died in 1976 in a test flight accident, pushing a prototype to its limits because that was what he had always done and what he would always do. The Airacobra's service with the Soviet Air Force continued until 1945, when the last operational units were finally retired and replaced with newer Soviet-designed fighters. But the tactics developed by Viktor and his fellow pilots did not disappear with the aircraft. The concept of low-altitude combat, of using terrain masking and surprise to overcome superior enemy aircraft, became a fundamental part of Soviet air combat doctrine. Future generations of Soviet pilots would study the battles fought by the Airacobra units and learn the same lessons that Viktor had discovered. That altitude advantage is meaningless if you are too high to see your enemy, and that the best weapon is not always the most powerful one, but the one that is used in the right way at the right time. The German pilots who survived encounters with Soviet Airacobras carried their own lessons back to their squadrons. They learned to respect Soviet pilots who had overcome initial disadvantages through innovation and courage. They learned that American equipment in Soviet hands could be just as deadly as anything the Luftwaffe could field. And they learned that the snake with teeth hiding below the clouds was not some mythical creature from folklore, but a real and deadly threat that had to be respected and feared. Today, historians who study the Eastern Front Air War recognize the P-39 Airacobra's service with the Soviet Air Force as one of the most successful examples of weapons adaptation in military history. An aircraft that failed in its originally intended role was reimagined and redeployed in a completely different tactical environment where its weaknesses became irrelevant and its strengths were fully exploited. The story of Viktor Petrov and his fellow Soviet Airacobra pilots serves as a reminder that success in war often comes not from having the best equipment, but from having the creativity and courage to use the equipment you have in ways that surprise and overwhelm your enemy. The legacy of the Soviet Airacobra pilots extends beyond military history into the broader understanding of how technology and tactics interact in combat. The same aircraft that American pilots called the flying coffin became the mount of Soviet heroes who transformed it into one of the most feared fighters on the Eastern Front. The difference was not in the aircraft itself, but in the mindset of the pilots who flew it and the tactical environment in which they chose to fight. Viktor Petrov's decision to dive toward the ground instead of climbing toward the sky changed not just his own fate, but the fate of thousands of Soviet pilots who followed his example and discovered that sometimes the best way to win is not to fight the battle your enemy expects, but to create an entirely different battle where your weaknesses do not matter and your strengths become overwhelming. In the frozen skies over the Eastern Front during 1943 and 1944, Soviet Airacobra pilots wrote a new chapter in the history of air combat. They proved that innovation and adaptation could overcome technological disadvantages. They demonstrated that courage and creativity were force multipliers that could turn an outcast aircraft into a war-winning weapon. And they showed the world that the P-39 Airacobra, dismissed and rejected by the nation that built it, could become a snake with teeth in the hands of pilots who understood how to make it strike.